Is there a good side to this Dylan Mulvaney thing? There might be. After all, there even is a Dylan Mulvaney thing because things like 9/11 have retreated into the past, and despite the dismal, incompetent way it ended, there's no war in Afghanistan in which Americans are losing their lives. We Americans waste time on grotesque, absurd, malevolent female impersonators and fops like Dylan Mulvaney and Jeffrey Marsh for one simple reason: we can, or we think we can. This is Dr. Avenir. Is Dr. Avenir. So is there a good side to this Dylan Mulvaney thing? There might be, sort of. After all, it's defensible to conclude that there even is a Dylan Mulvaney thing because cataclysmically catastrophic things like 9/11 have retreated into the past. 9/11 is now fully a generation in the past. My young adult manufacturing engineer's son, born a year before, has no recollection of it at all. And despite the dismal, incompetent way it ended, there's no war in Afghanistan in which Americans are losing their lives. In less recent history, an exhausted and traumatized America rebounded quickly to, quote, fat and happy, end quote, following the bloody spasms that were World War II and the Korean War, and all of society's ills, real and perceived, bubbled to the top of the national consciousness. Those national frictions had all been tamped down because of things like worry for the very survival of the nation. To our everlasting credit, America then remedied injustices that, as a nation, we had been perpetrating against, for example, black Americans. In the course of a generation, we stopped these injustices cold and began the arduous, messy task of trying to see whether redress was possible. We Americans also began an intensive period of reflection pertaining to how our nation treated any and every conceivable demographic group. Native Americans and Japanese Americans became the focus of a very sympathetic spotlight and rewriting of history even. And as time passed, we even began examining how we've treated people with serious and less serious mental disorders. People like Dylan Mulvaney, for example. But if for some reason World War II had continued, or if the Korean War had lasted longer, then the civil rights movement and feminism and all the social movements of today would have been pushed further into the future too. Our nation obsesses on drossy fribbles like Dylan Mulvaney, on race hustlers and gender grifters, on DEI foppery and ESG tripe for at least one reason: we can, or at least we think we can. Now these things had reared their ugly, bewarted heads long before the current relative calm, but the nation hadn't been able to focus fully on them before now. Interesting side note, of all these post-World War II movements, only several, all dealing with race or ethnicity, were even legitimate. The rest were grifts, trying to cash in on imaginary or invented injustices, or trying, largely successfully, to normalize mental disorders. Now, though, ISIS is largely gone, or at least inert, which is actually quite an accomplishment of Donald Trump's if you think about it. 9/11 is a full generation in the past. American involvement in wars appears quite distant. Our nation is tense, but peaceful. Hence, we believe we can expend valuable intellectual ergs on the likes of Dylan Mulvaney and his likeness on a beer can. But, and it's a big one, there are angry clouds gathering on the horizon. Russia, Ukraine, China, North Korea, inflation, unemployment, national debt, a catastrophically porous southern border, rapidly declining worldwide birth rates, and more. All of these things are what Alexander Solzhenitsyn called threads leading to a climactic place that he named a historical knot. Like a knot you might tie in a rope, only these knots represent the place where currents of history meet, or rather collide, frequently in cataclysmic and deadly upheavals. History, Solzhenitsyn said, is composed of strands, threads, and currents leading to these knots, the unraveling of which, often in violent upheavals, determines what the future looks like. These knots are of different sizes and scopes, but all histories are composed of them. Dylan Mulvaney and his fellow flouncing faux femmes represent the slack lengths of the cords and sinews making up the strands leading to Solzhenitsyn's knots, a kind of rest period in which the other more malevolent strands continue their inexorable trajectory toward the inevitable knot. But this lull before the tempest is not a healthy pause, because the minor irritant that is Dylan Mulvaney is an irritant nonetheless, a caustic, parasitic presence doing its level best to gnaw at the foundations of national coherence that remain in America. Knots, meganauts, giganauts, and such. Knots within still other knots. Nowadays we call historical knots fancy names like inflection points, but it's a sure thing that when comes the time to unravel our latest global knot, Dylan Mulvaney, CRT, DEI, ESG, and all the other fraudulent frippery currently corroding the nation will be rapidly forgotten. But at that moment, our concerns will be focused on things a good deal more pressing.